Los Angeles in the early 1990s was a burgeoning metropolis, boasting of its diversity as a world city poised to be the gateway of the Pacific. Los Angeles was home to over 100 different ethnicities from all points of the globe. It was perceived to be the international city that was going to lead America into the 21st century. The city had an African-American mayor who had been elected with a rainbow coalition that included blacks, whites, and other ethnic minorities. Bradley and his rainbow coalition promised Los Angeles prosperity and hope for everyone. However, the city, which had not seen economic downturn for more than 50 years, discovered that it was not immune from the 1990-91 recession, which jolted America with the largest number of bankruptcies in United States history. Under the gleaming skyscrapers that seemingly symbolize the economic prosperity of Los Angeles, the acquittal of the officers charged with the Rodney King beating on April 29, 1992, triggered the largest urban race riots in the history of the United States. In the process, it exposed the racial tensions simmering below the surface that led to violence, with the victims being targeted on the basis of race. The ensuing violence shattered LA's carefully contrived image as the melting pot for the 21st century. The melting pot had boiled over, resulting in 55 deaths and $1 billion in property damage, close to half of which was suffered by the Korean immigrant community. How did Los Angeles get to this? And could it happen again? Historically, the late 1980s and early 90s were times of economic transformation worldwide. With the advent of personal computer technology and information technology, the world was becoming smaller and smaller as people from all over the world were interconnected. Politically, the Berlin Wall, which had long symbolized the Iron Curtain, came crumbling down, followed by the dismantling of the Soviet Union, which signaled the demise of communism. Mainland China, with over 1.2 billion people, had opened itself to a market economy, and the rapid industrialization of developing countries around the world created a global economy, which we have come to take for granted today. With rising global competition, the United States was not immune either from the rapid changes that were taking place around the world. Businesses were forced to restructure, and traditional smokestack industries had to be sent abroad, which eliminated the blue-collar jobs that supported millions of the American middle class. California was hardest hit with the plant closings and the U.S. government's defense cuts on which the state's economy had been heavily dependent. Los Angeles, particularly its inner city, a 40-square-mile area known as South Central, took the brunt of the economic recession. This area had historically been known as Watts, and was the same place that had experienced the Watts riots in 1965.
The old industrial base of Los Angeles was largely gone. There had been a huge GM plant at Southgate, for instance. Most of the jobs, the industrial manufacturing jobs, which were good blue-collar jobs for people of all color, had pretty much gone away.
The corporations in Los Angeles, to make it very simple, have moved out of Los Angeles. We don't have large corporations. They went to the suburbs, or they went to South Asia or Mexico or Latin America, and they were replaced by non-unionized, lower-wage service jobs.
The fact that African Americans in particular were not beneficiaries of a globalized economy, were one of the groups that suffered most from community neglect, from the closure of traditional industries.
The early 1980s, you've got an interracial council that has gone and looked at South Los Angeles since the Watts riots. They did a report called McCone Revisited. Hardly anybody reported on it, but it was a very, very interesting report, and it told how conditions had really deteriorated. There had been some improvement. There had been some improvement in health. They built a hospital in South Los Angeles, but in housing, in interracial cooperation, and particularly in jobs, in poverty, the situation was deteriorating, and it's very, very clear. At the same time, Mayor Bradley, the city fathers, they're focused on making Los Angeles into this world city, which it was becoming. The port, finance, what we can now say, looking back at it, were the harbingers of the high-tech and internet age. All of this is happening.
This city will gladly tackle the recommendations which you've laid out for us. And I'm confident that we will come up with answers that ultimately will project this city as a city which serves as a crossroads of the world.
Right beneath these new gleaming skyscrapers that are being built in the city, there's increasing poverty, increasing racial conflict, and a very serious health and housing problems, and very serious conflicts between the minority community, particularly the African American community, and the police.
Much of the racial tension in Los Angeles over the years, historically, can be blamed on law enforcement, particularly the Los Angeles Police Department, which patrolled South Los Angeles with a minimal police force in a very tough way, as if it was an occupied country. Los Angeles was a highly segregated city. We have to remember this city has a long history of racism. The parks were segregated, the beaches were segregated in the 40s and the early 50s. The police enforced that segregation. You know, this whole balmy version of Southern California as this sort of nice laid-back place was not true at all.
The shifting demographics were another important change occurring in Los Angeles, particularly in South Central, an area traditionally concentrated by African Americans.
I had a map in front of me from 1960 of the African American population in Los Angeles County, and I put my hand on top of it. That's the part that we call South Central Los Angeles. It would cover 95% of all African Americans. By the year 1990, 30 years later, it would be much less, probably around 65%. And so one of the things that we already know is during that 20-year period, African Americans had begun to move out of this traditional community out to other parts of the county.
What happened after the Civil Rights Revolution is that it became possible for black people to live not, as whites would like to think, anywhere they chose, but in a lot of places. South Los Angeles spiraled into greater poverty. It had the paradox of removing a lot of the people who were the most stable influences in communities such as Watts, the middle-class people, and particularly the teachers and the doctors and the ministers. This is at a time of sexual liberation. It's a time of family instability, particularly in the African American community. And this phenomena of the black middle class moving out, partly because they were able to move out where they had not been able to move out before, I think was just one more destabilizing factor.
You also had the Latino immigrants who had been coming into the area and Latino population who for many years started on the east side of the county, began to move south in the southwest direction. At the same time, the Asian population had begun to concentrate itself. We've had Chinatown for a long time, but there really were no other major concentrations. But Koreatown started about this era to emerge.
I mean, I went away to Washington in 1975, and when I came back in 1978, suddenly there was Koreatown. I was really amazed.
It started out with some commercial enterprises on Olympic and on Pico Boulevard, and suddenly it became a concentrated area of Korean businesses. And they were on those streets right about where the edge of the African American population had come to. And so it wasn't unusual that over a very short period of time that Korean institutions like churches and others began to be found along Adams Boulevard. What you have is African Americans getting squeezed out of their territory. So the area was in flux. The area was changing. And it was changing both from the influx of Latinos and Asians coming into an area that traditionally had been African American.
After the Watts riots, I believe the store owners in South Central were Jewish. As a result of the LA riots, which happened actually just when the Korean immigration was beginning. The immigration laws were changed in 1965. The Jews withdrew, but it's not as though blacks stepped in. The only group that was willing to step in and provide this service in South Central were Koreans.
Koreans were pioneers. When nobody else wanted to invest in South Central LA, entrepreneurs from South Korea came into this area. A few Chinese, but mostly Koreans, began to buy property and began to sell goods that otherwise would not have been available in the area.
Korean merchants actually innovated the idea of swap meets so that you can actually have what would be comparable to a discount mall, where a whole bunch of small businessmen could set up small shops within the mall. And this way the African American community was able to access goods that they would otherwise have been unable to do.
Koreans began to immigrate to the United States in the late 70s and 80s. Before the Immigration Act of 1965 eliminated the quotas in place since 1924, U.S. immigration laws had virtually precluded Asians from entering the United States as immigrants. At the same time, Korea was undergoing rapid industrialization, rising from the ruins of the Korean War in the 1950s and becoming one of 5 nations in the world to produce automobiles. Because of its strong emphasis on education, Korea was led by a highly educated workforce, the secret to its success and rapid growth. However, strong competition limited upward mobility, prompting Koreans to look beyond their borders. Korean immigration, therefore, began in trickles as the new Immigration Act allowed families of current U.S. citizens and permanent residents to immigrate. Although there were only a few Koreans in the U.S. to begin with, soon waves of Koreans crossed the Pacific and settled largely in the major cities, such as New York and Chicago, with LA attracting the highest numbers. By the early 90s, most of the Korean immigrants in Los Angeles had been in the U.S. for less than 10 years.
The first generation who came over, many of them, very well trained, very good professionals, couldn't get into their profession because of the language barrier. So they became something else, became shop owners or storekeepers, innkeepers, and those were acceptable positions in marginal areas of the time to invest in.
It's not in general that Korean Americans or African Americans had tensions. We're talking about a geographic area, mainly around South Central Los Angeles, which is low-income neighborhood and had a history of impoverishment.
From Korean immigrants' perspective, owning and operating a mom-and-pop operation in South Central LA is a step down because the majority of them were college educated. They had a much higher aspiration. The American dream was much bigger.
But such an influx of Koreans in South Central was resented by the African American community.
And if you go back to 1980, the Amsterdam News, the largest black newspaper in New York City, had a front page headline talking about Korean invasion in African American neighborhood. LA Sentinel, largest newspaper in west of Mississippi, in the black community. In 1983, they also had a front page. They in fact had a 5-part series on the Korean immigrant merchants, how they were rude and disrespectful, and they were taking resources away from the black community, all that negativity.
But the sort of the position of African Americans in this country has been, historically a very tenuous one in terms of their relationship to the market. And African Americans have often felt somehow left out of the opportunity to participate in certain types of things like business and so forth and so on. So you have another group coming in when you feel you've been here for generations, your ancestors were slaves, and suddenly not only are you not having an opportunity to have a business, you then have to sort of patronize the business because it's the only outlet for goods you have in your community. And on top of that, there are cultural issues and differences that lead to misunderstandings, I guess, in terms of the motivations of the storekeepers and the patrons.
The Koreans didn't get off the boat as impecunious, uneducated people the way the Europeans had done in 1880. And I had to tell them, well, the Koreans who come here are not from the lowest class of Korea. They do not arrive with no money. They do not arrive with no education. They have resources.
It's also important to realize that Koreans coming from Korea don't think of themselves as minorities. I mean, they've grown up all their lives as part of a majority, so the topic, the concept isn't even sensible. When you come to the United States, you learn after a while that there's majority groups, minority groups, people of color, communities of color, ethnic, racial categories. But Koreans were just Koreans. They didn't see themselves as part of that other larger group of minorities.
I'm not certain that the Korean economy was fully aware of the fact that it needed to recycle that dollar some way.
In the literature, the sociological literature on blacks, there's a lot of treatment of their attitude toward external business owners. The attitude, and this goes back to the 1930s, if not even earlier than that, is that external business owners have no business in the black community, that they are taking up opportunities that otherwise black Americans could occupy, that they tend to siphon money away from the black community. In effect, I think it was scapegoating in that the Koreans were not really the root of their problem, but they thought they were.
Partially it's because there's nobody else around. The people who are really responsible, the banks who redline South Central LA, the corporations which laid people off or refused to hire people, The public institutions that, don't admit inner city kids, they're all out of reach, just like most of the wealthy taxpayers are. They're in their gated communities. They're on the other side of town. So the ethnic middleman community becomes then the lightning rod. They're the convenient scapegoat, whether they're Jews or Palestinians or Indians, Koreans.
In the early 90s, Black Korean tension began to surface as national news with the boycott of the Red Apple Market in New York. There were boycotts in Los Angeles as well, led most notably by Denny Bakewell of the Brotherhood Crusade. Once the mainstream media picked up on the so-called Black Korean conflict, it became a running mantra.
That in looking back on the early 90s, it's important to remember that the economy was in a state of recession. So there was a lot of tension developing because of problems in the economy, both locally and nationally. In a city where members of different ethnic groups are coexisting in the same place, it's not surprising that members of one ethnic group might blame another member, a different ethnic group, for problems that are taking place.
What took place in the years leading up to the riots was a series of stories that was reported in the LA Times and other national media outlets that involved merchant-customer disputes. If the racial equation did not add up to Korean merchant and African-American customer, stories of conflict involving merchant and customers were thrown out.
News media they always have their antenna up for various forms of conflict. And so if you have ready-made conflicts, or at least the perception of ready-made conflicts, like Black Korean tension, they're always in a position to try to exploit that.
For every incident of conflict that involved a Korean merchant and African-American customer, there were probably tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of transactions that went on between Korean merchants and African-American customers that did not result in violence or harm to either party.
Well, there's a disconnect between how the real world works and how people really are getting along versus the way the media is portraying the alleged conflict between blacks and, say, Korean Americans.
At the time, there were many efforts being made to improve relations between the two communities.
There were some efforts by Korean American community and African American activists to try to mediate the whole situation. It went on for several years, and the city didn't give any resources. Nobody really gave any resources. It was purely voluntary organization, and remarkable that it went on for 6 years. But sadly, when BKA announced that they are no longer going to continue, it made all the news media. When they were trying to do all the positive works, nobody cares.
What they don't understand is how they often are complicit with the very things that they're supposedly covering, And I think by covering conflict to the exclusion of harmony and collaboration and some of the other things that obviously happened in LA and between blacks and Koreans, for a lot of people who don't know any better or who get all of their information through media or most of what they know about the topic through media, they can shape their attitudes to a pretty large degree, which may also influence behavior.
The way the Korean American community tried to figure out what was wrong and had all sorts of meetings and wanted to reach out to the black community demonstrates their lack of racism.
The media's obsession with the Black Korean conflict made it appear as if the Korean American community and its cultural ignorance were the root cause of the problems in South Central.
LA Times primarily portrayed Korean immigrant merchants as rude and disrespectful and taking resources away from black community. On the other hand, New York Times was totally opposite. New York Times portrayed Korean immigrant merchants as a model minority. On the other hand, black portrayal led by Al Sharpton, presidential candidate. He was a racist. He was trying to use this to organize black community. But LA Times was opposite. Mr. Denny Bakewell was portrayed as a new voice for the black community.
Unlike New York Times, Los Angeles Times were unable to talk about the structural nature of the tension. Los Angeles Times always reported Black Korean tension as a racial tension, but their interpretation was always just attributing it to vast cultural differences.
It was a simplification which led to the implication that if once we understand each other, we'll all get along just fine. And well, I think there was some truth in that. My point was that there was this underlying economic dimension which was being overlooked. And that they didn't want to bring to the public's attention, I think because it would have complicated the discussion, and they wanted to feed the public pablum.
They almost, derived their pleasure in really reporting this horrible, violent conflict involving two ignorant races, and then saying that it's not just white, it could be new immigrants like Koreans who can be racist.
I'm ashamed by some of the issues that happened where people began to point the fingers at the Korean businessmen. They are a very small part of the whole process. The issues that were real was that this area was neglected for 35 years.
Koreans are recent newcomers to this country and don't have a significant political presence at all, either in LA or nationally. Because Koreans are industrious and hardworking, they have never become a favorite group of the political left. We live in an era where the left is the dominant cultural force. My generation of radicals really made this happen. People that I was a radical with in the 60s are now running the LA Times, literally. And so for them, the Koreans are a privileged group, even though Korean store owners work 18 hours a day and they have the whole family working the stores.
Nobody wants to work in a liquor store 7 days a week till midnight in dangerous conditions. There were immigrant people trying to scrape along so that this generation would work 7 days a week and so that their kid, could go to law school or, medical school.
In 1991, two important videotape news stories polarized the city of Los Angeles. The more famous one the entire world has seen many times over was the Rodney King tape.
Having it on videotape, then it awakened our eyes of all the community. Does this happen all the time?
After all, African Americans and other minorities, Latinos and other groups, particularly in Los Angeles, have been complaining about LAPD for years. Well, here for the first time, really, you had proof positive. You had a picture, you had an image, you had a video.
Not knowing the backstory of the situation of a high-speed car, a couple, married couple from the Highway Patrol who were pursuing them, get help from LAPD. Everybody converges at night, and lack of cooperation to start it.
Anybody who really considers what happened to Rodney King will see that this was a violent felon who was resisting arrest, who was ordered many times to go prone, and anybody who's been arrested as he has knows that that's what you do, who threw two 175, 200-pound officers off him in the scuffle. And I didn't see, and the court didn't see, a single blow that was not mandated as appropriate by the authorities in LA. People have to understand that subduing a very large individual like Rodney King used to be accomplished with a chokehold. It's very hard to bring a violent and huge individual to heel. And this was banned by the liberals on the police commission, which required officers then to use the baton to bring them down.
But in the court trial of People versus Powell, the jury learned that the tape had been edited, showing an incomplete account of the beating, which later came to haunt the prosecution.
Then they find out that the videotape is edited. They actually knew it. It's a slight editing of the videotape in terms of quantity. I think it gets it down from 81 to 68 seconds. But what it shows, what it omits, is showing that Rodney King charges in the direction of one of the officers, Lawrence Powell, who swings the most blows. The point is that when you see the abbreviated videotape, what you see is white officers beating a black man for no reason. So all of a sudden, there's a reason.
Furthermore, the trial of the Rodney King case, which should have been held in Los Angeles, was moved to an all-white neighborhood in Ventura County. It was a crucial victory for the defense, but the court's granting of the change of venue was not justified in law or in fact, and doomed the prosecution's case from the beginning. Historically, California courts have routinely denied change of venue requests. Considering the national media coverage the case received, there appeared to be no logical basis for granting the request to change venue.
There didn't seem to be any legal basis for not trying it in Los Angeles. Changes of venue had been routinely dismissed in high publicity, in high profile cases. The judge who upheld this, very good judge named Joan Dempsey Klein, she was concerned, as she told me, about the political situation in Los Angeles. She was concerned that there was going to be an eruption.
Not only that, the case was moved to Simi Valley, which was an all-white bedroom community, for no understandable reason.
I thought that particular trial should not have been in Simi Valley. It should have been in Oxnard or Ventura, in Riverside, or somewhere, even in Orange County, which has more diversity. Simi Valley happens to be, at the time, a place where there was affordable housing, and a lot of city employees, firefighters, police officers, were there. It was kind of like their neighborhood, so to speak, so there was some questions. I think the judge who was assigned to the case, which was originally supposed to be downtown here, who lived in the valley, I think he thought it was closer for him to get a courthouse available in Simi Valley as opposed to going someplace else.
They completely changed the jury by this process. They eliminated African Americans from the jury. You got a group of white jurors, middle-class people, people who always stop for the police. They're being shown a videotape of something that they haven't seen before, and they're being shown it by the prosecution. The whole context, which was created by the judiciary, the context of this trial favored the defense. And all of a sudden in this trial, the prosecutor, not the defense, the prosecutor is playing the whole videotape, which the jurors, all of them, I'm sitting as close to the jurors, and you can see their mouths agape, because they'd all seen, I'm sure, as I had, seen this videotape on television. And all of a sudden they are now seeing something they have never seen before in their lives.
The King verdict was not the only spark of rage for blacks in this city. Last year, black teenager Latasha Harlins was killed by a Korean merchant who had accused her of shoplifting. The Korean woman was convicted of voluntary manslaughter and sentenced to 5 years probation, a sentence the black community felt to be outrageously lenient.
The jurors, in what was clearly a compromise verdict, reached what I think was the right verdict. They convicted Sun Ja-du of voluntary manslaughter. She had intended to do this. Here you have a case where a judge, an inexperienced judge who was really thrown into this trial by senior judges who didn't want to try the case themselves, renders a horrible decision after an arguably just verdict, and just adds all these flames to the oil that is burning in Los Angeles.
What resonated most deeply in the black community about that event wasn't so much the incident itself, which was horrible and unfortunate that it had to happen this way, but that, again, it was another event that was videotaped, and the surveillance camera in the store captured it on videotape. And for many in the black community, Sun Ja-du got a slap on the wrist for shooting this young black woman.
In the immediate years preceding, 2 or 3, there were 37 Korean store owners who were murdered, and not reported at all by the media before, during, or after the riots. This was a tragedy, but it was converted by racist black leaders into a war against the Koreans, as the Koreans are murdering black people and getting away with it.
Was she seeing Latasha Harlins, or was she seeing a despised category of people?
Blacks felt, wait a minute now, this girl was shot in cold blood, quote unquote, and nothing's happened here. She gets your hand slapped or something. But that same kind of disdain, that same kind of fervor and disgust and what have you, that was displayed by black folks back at that time, was never displayed towards the system that caused the problem in the first place.
So there's no excuse for taking, the life of that child. But look, I mean, to make this the original sin of the Korean community, that was quite a leap.
Interestingly, the LAPD, under intense pressure following the release of the King tape, called an uncharacteristic press conference, which immediately raised more questions.
It's important to consider the timing of the killing of Latasha Harlins. It occurred 13 days after the beating of Rodney King, and less than 24 hours after 4 officers involved in the beating were indicted.
The death of 15-year-old Latasha Harlins. She was shot in the head by 51-year-old Soon Jadu, co-owner of the Empire Liquor Market in South Central Los Angeles. The shooting took place Saturday. Police say a security camera shows that the girl was not attempting to steal a bottle of orange juice. The grocer has been charged with murder.
The timing and the kind of hastiness with which the press conference was called immediately raised some questions as to why the police department was going out of their way to air these concerns, which in the past, the police department had not really catered.
Had this been any other person, not a Korean storekeeper, but a black storekeeper, and a black girl had been killed, nobody would have filed on the black storekeeper.
Whether or not there was any conscious effort to redirect attention, it's difficult to say, but the end result was that a prominent tragedy was called to the attention of the media.
The LA Times and other local media then reported the incident as a racial killing.
See, the lead says Korean-born Soon Jadu. Why the gross Soon Jadu has to be Korean-born? She's an American citizen. Would the LA Times say every time they use Henry Kissinger, German-born Henry Kissinger? No. But that's always they are injecting the race card.
If you read most style guides, like LA Times has their own style manual of what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to write, and AP has their own style book, and most broadcast news organizations use either one of those or they use them in conjunction. When you look up race, it says essentially that you're not supposed to specify the race of an individual in the story unless it's pertinent to the story. Well, obviously, these news people assumed that the race was pertinent to the story.
When a black gangster assaults a Korean, when a black holdup man robs, what you have is a criminal assaulting a businessman. But somehow the ethnic identities would narrow that focus so that it became black on Korean crime.
I know in the initial screenings of that surveillance tape, they showed the entire tape, but as time went on and future references were made to the shooting, there was kind of editing shorthand that took place, and it was to show the actual, just the moment at which Latasha was shot, and very clearly shot in the back of the head.
Some blacks see the Koreans as a merchant class that takes advantage of the black community. It didn't help when last year a Korean grocer shot and killed a black teenager, as seen on this surveillance tape.
They just showed the shooting. They didn't show Latasha Harlins punching the woman in the face. And that's, in my view, that's quite calculated by the media.
When the city was in need of political leadership, the leaders failed to lead. Using the Rodney King tape as leverage, Mayor Bradley tried to remove Police Chief Daryl Gates, with whom he had a running feud since his days as a police officer.
Unfortunately, there was a battle between the then Chief of Police and the then Mayor of the City of Los Angeles. There was a communication gap, and I was involved because my boss, the President of the City Council, was the one leader in the city who could really get both men together and talk to them in some respects. So it was a very challenging time.
Big stroke of Mayor Bradley was appointing this commission headed by Warren Christopher, who is a very distinguished attorney and subsequently Secretary of State.
The Christopher Commission will deal with the whole range of the problem of police brutality in Los Angeles.
He was mortified, as I say in my book, when he's watching the television soon after he's appointed, and Bradley is giving a news conference, and he's already got the conclusions, and he's saying this guy should be fired.
As mayor, I have reluctantly concluded that I can no longer wait for Daryl Gates to do what is best for the LAPD. I can no longer count on him to act in the best interests of all of Los Angeles. That is why today I called upon Daryl Gates to resign.
I have a little difficulty understanding how the mayor would appoint a commission on one day and then preempt that commission on the next day. That doesn't seem to make much sense.
He considered resigning, but of course resigning would have been such a slap in the face that he went through with it.
I would certainly welcome any rapprochement between the two of them that would calm this controversy. It would make it possible for us to do our work in an atmosphere that was not quite so highly charged.
Mayor Bradley at that time was the mayor of the city of Los Angeles. And he had been elected with a coalition of white and African American voters. That coalition had begun to break down.
The mayor and I disagree. I am convinced that the chief is not the issue. Improving the department, making change in the department is the issue. And the more we focus on the chief, the more we call for his resignation, the more he digs in his heels, the longer it's going to take to get from here to there. I am convinced that calling for the chief's resignation polarizes the city. It does not heal the city.
We will be at the city council tomorrow morning, essentially telling the city council as citizens of Los Angeles how deeply resentful we are of the action they've taken, overturning the decision of the police commission.
Well, I don't think we should be fighting, quite frankly. I've been disappointed with all of this rhetoric that's been going on. For the life of me, I don't understand why why so much violent rhetoric aimed in my direction. I understand how concerned people are and how angry they are at what happened in Foothill. I'm as angry as they are.
The chaos or anarchy in City Hall in a way reflected the lack of direction in the city in general.
And in the charter, the mayor really had very little control over the police chief, believe it or not. I mean, the police chief in Los Angeles had always historically their own power base.
The city wasn't really polarized on racial lines. The black community polarized the city, which is a little different.
Once again, what that left everybody with was a polarization. You had to either be for the African Americans or against them.
There was a lot of tension on city council, a lot of games going back and forth. Basically, there was a race riot going on in city council. Blacks over here, Latinos over here, the mayor over here, LAPD over here.
On April 29, 1992, the jury in Simi Valley acquitted the 4 police officers to the surprise of the public, who had been misled by the media to believe the officers would be convicted. When the verdict was announced, the television media, which had already prejudged the outcome based on the incomplete video account of the beating, also sounded outraged.
The 4 police officers who were videotaped repeatedly beating an unarmed man were found not guilty on all but 1 count.
The media had conveniently overlooked the fact that Rodney King had been captured following a dangerous pursuit and had exhibited terrifying strength while resisting arrest.
The question as to why the media is so irresponsible in this matter is, has to do a lot with American history. I mean, America has committed in its past history one great crime against black people. I mean, blacks were slaves in this country. It's nothing this country actually innovated. In fact, and we inherited slavery from the British, and we led the world along with the British in ending slavery. However, it remains a very grievous stain on American history. And to compensate for this, or to overcompensate, people on the left in this country, who are the people who run the media, exaggerate and bend over backwards, if you will, to protect black criminals, and then to make them appear victims of other people.
When I heard Mayor Bradley on the radio that afternoon,
we have had enough.
He seemed to have forgotten that he was mayor of the city, and it sounded as if he was inciting a riot, actually.
Now here you are, a jury of American citizens. You see the same thing that everybody else in the whole world sees, and you still come back with the message that the cops have done no wrong and there has been no inequity of justice based upon this person's color. That caused the explosion.
The leaders of the black community in Los Angeles then did the unbelievably irresponsible thing of inciting a riot. This includes the head of the AME Church, Chip Murray. I've listened several times to the radio replays of the meetings they held there, who incited people to set LA aflame, which is what they did.
And we ain't gonna take this just lying down. We say no.
There was, of course, the Rodney King riot, but then there was also the bread riot. The fact that the city was in the worst recession since 1938.
You can think of riots and civil disobedience, civil disturbances as sort of the voiceless getting a voice. because the fact that they occur means the system is not listening to people and their problems and their needs.
They were people who basically were not just African American, were not just Latino, were not just immigrants, they were have-nots.
I don't think it was limited to African Americans, and it was not limited to Latinos. It was African Americans and Latinos and whoever else lived in those poor communities. It was poverty that was reacting. It was anger and frustration that was reacting. And whoever lived in those communities was a part of it.
It was the first time we had active helicopters with cameras that people could see what was going on, so there was a reaction going on. You know, everything was live, so people kind of got inspired to do things in a negative way, or what they may have thought was positive, which was unfortunate.
And then the police response was no response. And that's what we saw in Koreatown, that's what we saw in Pico Union.
When the riot started, the police tried briefly to try and do something about it. They got overwhelmed, and it was a command decision to pull back. And it was almost like, let them destroy themselves, let them kill themselves, let them do whatever they want. We'll just make sure they're on the perimeter, they don't move out of this area. And that's basically what the police did.
I talked to two of the people who were among the gang people who were at Florence and Normandy, and when the police retreated, they assumed the police were going to come back and force. I mean, they may have been thugs, but they weren't stupid, because they were what they were going to do when the police came back and forces. They were going to leave, as anybody in their right mind would, but the police didn't come back.
While the mainstream media was busy covering the massive burning and looting in Los Angeles, the Korean ethnic media was reporting the human stories of how the Korean merchants were caught completely off guard. They had to witness the years of hard work go up in flames literally within hours.
There is no doubt that Korean Americans were targeted. On this one street in South Central, black businesses on one side of the street were spared, while Korean businesses on the other side were wiped out.
The riot that ensued was a race riot. People were targeted on the basis of race. Black people put on their stores or their doors, black owned, blacks live here, and were left alone. Several minority communities were targeted. There were 58 people, of course, murdered. But the main brunt of the attacks was the Korean community. I think 2,000 Korean businesses were destroyed, a statistic that was, if it was appeared in the press, was wildly underplayed. And this was a vicious attack on the Korean community by criminal elements in the black community. This was a riot of black street gangs. It wasn't a riot of ordinary black people who, like the rest of LA, were huddled in their homes, fearful of the violence.
In South Central LA, Crips and Bloods stop fighting, because we got a real fight going on right now.
42 years down the drain. I mean, can't people realize what they're doing is wrong? This is not the way to overcome racism.
여기 헬리콥터가 뜨고 우리 종합은 프론트맨에서 지네들이 더 무섭고 더 먼저 도망을 가고요. 나랑 우리 남편은 더 어떻게든 그냥 정말 나오는데도 우리는 살아나온 것만 해도 정말로 다행으로 살아서 왔고요. 우리 남편은 하루 12시간 15분도 크루즈했고요. 우리가 미국 온 지 16년이 됐는데 쟤밖에 안 남았고요.
When the riots came, it was very clear to me that not every store was looted, not every store was burned, but almost every single Korean-owned enterprise was, in fact, burned and looted.
I think the perception was Koreans joined the rest of non-black Americans in looking down on me and thinking that I'm junk and thinking that I'm absolutely nothing. It was wrath, because the pattern of the burning shows there were some stores not burned, they were protected. Guys would stand out in front and protect it, just as the churches were not burned, just as black businesses to a large extent were not burned. Some black businesses that were considered traitorous towards blacks were burned. But there is enough of a pattern in the burnings to cause one to question, were blacks hateful of Koreans merely because they were Koreans? Or were blacks hateful of the disposition of Korean merchants to some extent?
After the verdict, we began receiving phone calls from the Korean merchants who were stuck in South Central Los Angeles. They said they called 911, but the police was not coming.
When I got home that evening, my wife was pacing in front of the TV, and she had the Korean radio on full blast as well. On the TV, you could actually see burning Los Angeles and the looting, but on the Korean radio, you could actually hear merchants who were still stuck there and frantically calling the radio station saying that the police department and the fire department were not responding to their calls. So I immediately got on the phone and started calling the network television stations to apprise them of the situation. Of course, they were not interested and nothing came of it.
There were so many calls coming in. We had to go on emergency broadcast. We connected the callers directly to the radio. The radio was being broadcast live by the callers.
제가 아는 흑인 친구가 얘기하듯이 얘기를 들었습니다. 제가 두 방화범들이 서로 누가 100군데 불을 먼저 많이 지르나 그거를 내기를 했답니다. 그래갖고 이 친구들이 그거를 시합을 해갖고 이게 보통 이게 방화범 아니면 그렇게 불을 지를 수가 없습니다.
We stayed up that night until 2 in the morning, until the looting died down. We concluded that that was part of the cost of doing business in South Central, which obviously was a rough neighborhood.
They were coming right up to Koreatown, as you well know.
Next day on the way to work, I was still listening to the radio, and a caller called in and said that his African-American friends were telling him that the African-American gangs that were burning and looting the night before were sending out leaflets saying that Koreatown was next. When I got into the office that morning, I looked out the window and I could actually see columns of smoke coming up Vermont Avenue. Pickup trucks full of African-American youth, obviously gang members, with guns, and were shooting, and they were driving through Wilshire Boulevard. You couldn't see any police cars.
Next morning, we were receiving calls that Koreatown was the next target. We then received calls from the LAPD. They told us to announce to the Korean business to close early and leave. We began broadcasting everyone to close the businesses and leave town.
Richard Choi on the radio urging Korean American business people to close their businesses and evacuate Koreatown. So I drove to Radio Korea and told Mr. Choi that we must tell the people to stay and defend the town.
Around noon, David Kim, our attorney, came to the station.
I told him that on the way to the radio station, I saw these Latinos standing in front of their houses and apartments waiting for the town to empty out. It was obvious that there were no police cars around and that the LAPD was not going to defend the town. And I told them that if we evacuated, then we would be leaving the town to the looters who would burn just like they did South Central the day before. Of course, when I was telling him this, I knew that in Korea, the Korean immigrants had served, I think, something like 3 years in the military because it was mandatory. And they all knew how to use the weapons. They were trained.
I asked him if that was legal. He told me,
under the U.S. Constitution, you have the right to bear arms. And that in a situation like this, of course we can defend our property.
We changed our broadcast from leaving our town to defending our town.
This was based on the assumption that the National Guard would arrive and would eventually give us support. Even though we heard that the National Guard did come, we couldn't see them in Koreatown. And we were left to defend ourselves.
Two Korean businessmen doing for themselves what neither police nor National Guard are on hand to do.
There was a man out here who says we're all trained to shoot. Why? What's the feeling?
Well, see, we have no hatred towards black people. We have nothing against anybody. All we wanted to do is work hard and make it like the rest of us, and we know. But people are driving by shooting at us, and we have to do something about it. We have no police support whatsoever. National Guard, I've heard about it from early this morning. We don't see any of that support coming out. We have a lot of shotguns in here and some handguns, but we have to use them because we have to defend our lives. We have to defend our property. People out there watching, please just don't sit there and enjoy this great exhibition.
It's not entertainment, It's not a Hollywood action shot.
No,
this is the actual life that we're talking. We got shot in what? Car windows, fly-by bullets come out. They're shooting at us. We may be shooting at up there, but they're shooting at us. So far, we've been shooting up. But when it comes to worse, We're not gonna sit around shooting upside. We're gonna shoot at them. That's how close we got to right now.
Those of us who were on the commission were called to a meeting at the Transamerica building, which was Transamerica building then. We were on the roof of the building, and the police were trying to tell us that things were under control. And they told us that the real critical point at that moment were those streets approaching Koreatown. I mean, it wasn't very reassuring. I think it's the first thing to say, seeing the fires going up, even as they were telling us that things were under control. And we all looked towards Koreatown, and there was nothing there. And so the police were not there. And then they offered to give some of us a drive through the area so we could see what some of the issues were. And I chose to go to Koreatown in my drive-through. And the police were probably going 60 miles an hour down the street. I mean, they weren't stopping for lights or anything. They were just speeding through because they were afraid. And what we saw were Koreans in front of their businesses, protecting their businesses. That's what we saw. And you were right. That area was targeted, and people were on their way. And if the Koreans had not themselves defended the area, it would have burned.
That night, Koreatown turned into a war zone. There were gun battles waging between the African-American gangs who came in groups with weapons, and Korean-American merchants defended the businesses. Radio Korea became the command post for these people, and people would call in to say where they're being attacked, and other volunteers in other areas would actually converge there to try to help them. One ironic thing was that the policemen who were saying that they were too busy to stop the looting were actually arresting the Korean volunteers for possession of arms without permits. We couldn't tell if they were trying to protect the gangs or they're trying to protect the Korean merchants. The LAPD were telling the volunteers that they could not defend businesses or stores or areas where the actual owners were not present. But they're the ones who told these people to lock up and leave. And when the volunteers were trying to put out a fire on 6th and Western, for example, they arrested them, they confiscated their weapons, and told them to leave. It was a small fire that could have been put out by these volunteers. That building burned to the ground.
Because of the downpouring of the ashes, and it was difficult to breathe and walk around in the town, we were heading towards the suburbs. And as we were driving out, to my surprise, the National Guard trucks were visible on the road, on the highways, and instead of heading towards Koreatown, they were heading into the suburbs. And to me, that was just unimaginable that these troops were present, and but obviously told not to protect the area of the most danger, but to protect the suburbs.
By about 2 a.m. May 1st, the fighting had died down. That's when a woman by the name of Mrs. Cho called. She said, "We must hold a protest demonstration." She said that she was planning one for the next day at the Wilton Theater parking lot. At the time, I did not understand its importance. We were still trying to defend our town.
I spoke with my sister-in-law at that time and said, we can't just sit here and do nothing. We have to at least express what's in our hearts and let others know the wrong that we feel is occurring in our midst. And so we joined the rally there at the Wilton Theater parking lot. And as I looked around the parking lot, there were media crews from ABC, CBS, and NBC. And I just thought, they're not understanding anything that this gentleman is saying. And if we are to voice our distress, we need to be speaking in English. So I basically approached the gentleman on the podium and said, I am bilingual. I'd like to interpret the things that are being said. And then he looked at me and he said, "Oh, well, here's the microphone." And instead of me interpreting, he basically left the podium, and I was standing there with the microphone.
After the initial rally, the Korean American leaders formally organized a rally at Ardmore Park the next day.
We immediately began urging Korean Americans to come out to the demonstration at Ardmore Park and show our unity to the American people. The outpour of donations and volunteerism was immense. The kind of solidarity we saw was something I had never imagined possible by Korean American people.
I was driving to the rally at Ardmore Park, but there was a complete gridlock around the Koreatown area. You could not get into Koreatown because there were so many cars that were coming from all over Southern California. I think they were saying that there were 50,000 people who were present at the rally, but because we were stuck, I could only hear it on the radio. By the time I got to the rally, everybody had left for the march on Olympic Boulevard. And I ran into John Lee, who was a reporter for the LA Times. And I told him about the role the radio station played as a communication lifeline for the Korean American community. The next day, that story appeared on the front page of the LA Times, along with the march that took place that day.
In the Koreatown section of Los Angeles, hard hit by arson and looting, 100,000 people took to the streets in a rally for peace. Many of the Koreans say they do not agree with the verdict in the Rodney King case, that they now are also victims of injustice.
We're going to get victimized for no reason? This is unfair.
Tremendous event for Korean Americans, and probably one of the defining moments for Korean American identity, because here was a group of people who were unfairly targeted, and our response was not down with African Americans or down with America. It was, we want peace. We're here to live in harmony with our neighbors, and we would like peace. And despite the wrongs that were done to us, our response is, we want to make America a better place to live.
Korean Americans in Los Angeles were frustrated because of Los Angeles media's complete disregard for Korean American plight, and the fact that we were being attacked, and the fact that for them, these businesses were their livelihood. And through this march, Korean American people managed to attract the mainstream media's attention, and that we were victims of something that we had nothing to do with.
When the politicians and police had abandoned the Korean American community, President Bush came to console the Korean Americans devastated by the destruction of not only their businesses, but their belief in the American dream.
Well, in behalf of the Korean American community here in Los Angeles, Mr. President, thank you very much for coming and welcome to Koreatown. Needless to say, your visit with us has a great significance because I think most of the Korean Americans here in Los Angeles felt abandoned by the government and the law enforcement officials when the April 29 riots occurred. We came to this country with nothing, and we're confident that we'll be able to rebuild our community, and we would like to request your assistance in our being able to rebuild as quickly as possible.
To really affect the change on matters we're talking about here today, I think it calls for participation in the political process, not to give up on it. This is a serious setback. And I think I maybe have more of a responsibility on this point, make clear to the American people that you're welcome and that this is an aberration. This isn't the American dream.
Every crisis creates an opportunity. I think the fact that Mr. President came here sends a very strong message to the outside communities that the President cares and that something needs to be done with the Korean community. We would like to make this our opportunity to utilize federal funds to rebuild Koreatown as a better community. Thank you very much, and thank you very much.
What was ironic was that Mayor Bradley, who had accompanied the president to South Central earlier that day, was conspicuously absent during the president's visit. None of the local media covered the historic visit either. The already down Korean American victims had to experience another setback when their attempt to rebuild was curtailed by the Los Angeles City Council. There were over 1,700 markets, referred to as liquor stores, when in reality they were mom-and-pop convenience stores. By taking away their ability to sell liquor on the premises, the City Council was making it economically unfeasible for them to reopen.
Immediately after the riots, the city passed a law which ostensibly for the world said, oh, we're going to help everybody rebuild. This is a law to expedite the rebuilding process. When, however, the Korean South Central liquor store owners went through it, they were told they had to get conditional use permits, and those conditional use permits that were issued to them with conditions that no one else had, and with conditions that they couldn't reopen. It was too prohibitively expensive.
The power of the city council is to deal with land use issues. And the council had neglected South Los Angeles. When I say that, they had not dealt with the issue of overpropensity of liquor distribution outlets, and that's just an example. And so in order to change the use, the council did make it harder for you to establish that kind of a business in that area after the civil unrest.
The LA City Council punished the victims of the riot, the Korean community, by outlawing or taking away liquor licenses, which is one of the ways that Korean stores were able to be economically viable. This is exactly parallel to the NAACP suing the gun manufacturers for producing guns.
The council was saying that they were doing this for the sake of the community, but the timing couldn't have been worse. To do this when they had been victimized, and to say that they want to make the city a better place at the expense of these victims was highly unfair. Would they have done the same had the merchants been African American?
But I don't think the council was trying to, at the time, purposely hurt a particular ethnic group in the city.
Obviously, the fact that the Korean American community did not have political power and was not able to fight back made it easy for them.
Mark Ridley Thomas was a real disappointment. What happened when he was there was that he suddenly began to feel like he had to stand up for African Americans, not his constituents, not everybody who lived in his district, just African Americans.
He certainly went out of his way to make sure that these people didn't go into business. For example, normally these approvals would stop at the Planning Commission. There's no appeal from that. The Planning Commission was giving approvals to these people that would have allowed them to go back into business. And Mark Ridley Thomas was running around all the time. Last minute coming in, he found out another liquor store had been approved by the commission and he'd appeal it to the city council. And so all of these things got appealed to the city council. Now the way the city of Los Angeles works, it's called ward courtesy. If you're elected from a particular district and not from the city at large, that district is basically your district. And for land use matters that occur within that district, you have the final say of what goes on. All of this was in Mark Ridley Thomas's district, and he actually effectively acted as a dictator over what went on. So whatever he wanted to happen, the council would fall in line, and that's what would happen. Mark Ridley Thomas was somebody who Korean American community has supported from the outset of his campaign. Because of the Black Korean tension at the time, we knew that we needed an African American leader who would be able to mediate between the African American residents and the Korean American merchants at the time. Once he was elected, however, instead of being the mediator, he actually became the voice for the African American activists.
Not only the Los Angeles City Council, but the courts had also failed to check the city's abuse of power. Under the ABC laws, the requirement to reapply for a liquor license was exempted if the business's closure was due to an act of God.
There's a code section that says that if you're out of business for 30 days, you lose your ABC license and you have to reapply, and cities can implement new laws against you. But if you are forced out of business by an act of God, then you have a reasonable period of time to get back into business. And our argument was that the riots fell into this category. After all, that's the reason the legislature put it there in the first place. It wasn't your fault, and what on earth is the difference between being struck by lightning and having a rioter throw a burning torch into your building? It's the same thing. It's not your fault, you get burned down.
However, the California Court of Appeal ruled that a civil disturbance was not an act of God. What's more, even the governor's office had abandoned the Korean American community.
So we're going to the Court of Appeal, and I told the ABC, I said, look, you guys, I mean, it doesn't do me any good to say in front of the court, this is the way the ABC interprets it, because they don't believe me. You guys need to file an amicus brief and say, this is, we agree with Mr. Jones. And they said, we'll do that. No amicus brief appeared. So after the case was on, I call them up and say, you guys left me twisting in the wind. And they said, well, we did. We don't file amicus briefs as the ABC. We request that the Attorney General file an amicus brief. And we did that. But someone in Pete Wilson's office told the Attorney General not to file an amicus brief. So the owners were abandoned all the way up to the top of the state government.
The Korean American experience during the riots had been an important lesson about the American political process.
I think what was particularly shocking for many of the Korean American merchants and their families was that the violence that took place and the losses to Korean Americans which took place, in a way, unveiled a level of vulnerability which they may not have believed really existed.
When I think of the LA riots, I also think about all of the hardworking Korean American shop owners, many of whom did not have insurance, were burned out and were never made whole. We've had other disasters like 9/11 where families were compensated, yet the Korean American community suffered this huge, huge assault. Where are their reparations? Many families have never been made whole. Many families were driven out of business. Many divorces took place as a result of the riots, but nobody ever made them whole. If this had happened to the black community, if a group had targeted black stores and burned them out, do you think the city would have done nothing about making those entrepreneurs whole? It's a double standard.
They paid for it, with the loss of their businesses, with indignity, humiliation, and that's something that's never really been put right. That's an apology that hasn't ever been made.
I believe that this was a turning point for the Korean American consciousness. They came to realize for the first time that American dream was not achieved by simply making money and sending your children to the top universities, that it all could be taken away within hours.
The reflection of this period is that while the Korean American community sort of lost its innocence, I think it also got smarter. It's got smarter about how do you play the political establishment, how do you donate money that's going to make a difference into your issues, and who's going to carry forth that.
Even assimilated Korean Americans who had come to this country early, for the first time realized that you needed to be united as one and to have a common voice, and that you need to participate politically in this country as Korean American people, along with other minorities.
What are the factors that contributed to the outbreak of violence among the minority communities in this multi-ethnic city of Los Angeles?
1992 was simply a repeat of 1965. The recent riots in France that burned many cities communities to the ground would be similar. So the phenomena will continue to happen. It's a phenomena of the indifference of the overclass towards the underclass with the neutrality of the middle class.
Now, in 1965, there's a tremendous will to understand the causes of the outbreak. What's so striking in 1992 is that you had the opposite consensus. People in power of all kinds did not want explored in any depth what happened. So this is not an event with a single cause, a unifying anger like 1965. This is a very complex social explosion with various kinds of actors involved. And it's tragic that there's been so little research, dialogue, or simply the moral will to probe deeply into what happened and what its lessons are for us today.
Although Los Angeles was being transformed into a city of immigrants, its leadership failed to recognize this important shift in demographics. The traditional black-white paradigm was no longer applicable to multiracial and multi-ethnic Los Angeles.
Los Angeles has always been perceived as a polyethnic epicenter, really a place where people can go to and really quickly integrate into. I think that's the perception. The reality is we really have not prepared. We have not really prepared communities, we have not prepared government entities to really respond to points of difference that are very legitimate.
And one reason, of course, is most immigrants don't possess the vote. They don't elect members of the council or county supervisors, so their interests tend to be ignored.
429 is a wake-up call for not only Koreans, Asian Americans, but the blacks and Latinos too. Because you cannot protect your own civil right at the expense of another. You see, that's when civil right leaders become nationalist, racist, and nativist.
You witnessed a pogrom against the Korean American community. What was unusual in this case is the nativism and the attack on Asian immigrants came from within the African American community itself. Politicians playing the role of ethnic chieftains. It may seem ironic, but in a way, I think the Korean community in 1992 were the victims of the decline of the black left, the black radicalism. I don't think the Black Panther Party would have attacked Korean businesses or glorified it in the way that some of the rappers did.
Los Angeles's political leadership was polarized along racial lines over the resignation of Daryl Gates. The city had no political leadership at the time.
A lot of the leaders, Mark Ridley Thomas, for example, who later criticized the LAPD for not having enough presence in South Central, should go back and look at what they said while the jury was deliberating, which was that the presence of the police in the street would have been provocative.
They'll say something that's also true, that they weren't getting clear political direction or policy direction because police are not supposed to brutalize people. The police wanted the politicians to take the blame for whatever the police were going to do.
And so what if the police were criticized for having too much of a presence on the streets or being too heavy-handed? That kind of criticism is made in every city in America several times a year. How does that begin to compare with a riot that cost the lives of more than 50 people and all this incalculable property damage? I've always argued, I think the evidence is overwhelming, that this was a preventable riot. It was a breakdown in leadership. And again, as I blame the judges, not the juries, for what happened on the judicial side of this, I blame the police and the political leadership. And I think the police leadership has a special role because no matter how clueless Tom Bradley was, and he was totally clueless, the police are, after all, charged with, their motto is to protect and serve, and they usually do the protection part at least pretty well, and they didn't.
My personal belief is that the LAPD and the chief threw the riot. I mean, now why were they not prepared? Well, either incompetence, and I don't think, even though the LAPD is not as competent by far as they proclaimed at the time, but they would not have a plan.
We had what we thought was an appropriate response. We were trying not to be provocative. We didn't want to bring out a self-fulfilling prophecy.
There was a lack of a plan, a lack of a driving force to have a plan, proper deployment and all of that. And I mean, I just think that, it was sort of like, well, we'll show you, we'll show you, Mayor Bradley, and all of that.
The media failed, I think, very badly to tell people, hey, you've got a trial where these guys are likely to be acquitted. I covered most of that trial. Most of the reporters thought they were going to be convicted.
In addition to not reporting and not informing the public of the actual situation surrounding Rodney King, played just the beating of Rodney King over and over and over again. It was a kind of incitement to black people to do something. I mean, it looked like police were just beating up somebody because he was black.
Till today, there's been no accountability of really looking backwards and seeing that relationship between how the media, through its irresponsibility, can also incite communities to do offensive things against each other.
The LA has a cutthroat media market, and any racial incident is tailor-made for the TV ratings and the circulation.
The media is often accused of liberal bias, and there is a liberal bias in the media, and I mean, those of us in the media should be honest enough to say that. But the much greater bias in television is mindlessness. I don't think it was an attempt to build viewership. I think it was really an absence of something, an absence of thought and reflection about what they were doing.
They think of themselves as, sort of covering what's really going on out there and providing the people at home with the information they need to make sense of what's happening around them. That's the way they understand themselves. What they don't understand is how they often are complicit with the very things that they're supposedly covering.
Where I am critical is of the mainstream print media in Los Angeles, because unlike television, the Los Angeles Times is not mindless.
All of those diversions, I think, come into play and are reinforced by the media coverage, the way it was presented. And do a disservice to us in terms of understanding our relationships to one another and how to move forward in the multiracial, multi-ethnic community we have here in Los Angeles.
If you go to South Central today, the poverty is still there, unemployment is still high, gang cultures are still too strong, and old resentments haven't died, and there's a sort of underlying tension. But we do have a truce going on, and that's what I call it, a truce. But it's not built on something very solid. It isn't built on real understanding of each other, and it isn't built on real relationships. So until something happens that changes that, then the potential is always there for this to happen again.
Because while the economy goes up and goes down and race relations improve and decline, I wouldn't rule out the possibility that there may be at some point in the future, again, some kind of racial violence in Los Angeles. Maybe not involving the same groups.
Because the 1992 civil unrest went up to the edge of Beverly Hills, to the edge of Westwood. And so all of us are involved in this, and nobody escapes it. If we want to peacefully coexist on this family and not see this environment, this atmosphere come to an end, we better learn how to get along with each other, whether we like each other or not.
We have so many workers from different parts of the world mixed into our communities. We can either do the scenario of embrace and help those immigrants integrate into our society, become citizens, work hard and see the benefits of their hard work, but integrate. Or we could choose to try to scapegoat them, make them responsible for all the ills of society, isolate them, which only will create tensions.
The whole story of American immigration has been one of conflict, strife, bigotry, and people overcoming that, generation by generation.
While I think we have a serious problem with illegal immigration, I'm a believer that it's immigrants who are making this country strong. Americans have lost touch with those values. My son works in the computer industry, and actually I went to his graduation class in computer science. Everybody was Jewish or Asian. That was it. This country cannot survive without its immigrants.
Los Angeles is what I believe is an international capital for the 21st century, and it really has the best opportunity to jet a pole ahead and jump over many different hurdles and really unite communities that have come from all points of the globe. We have a lot to teach the United States. I think we have a lot to teach the world. I mean, we are, the mythology is somewhat true. We are the Ellis Island of the 21st century. And I think people who got to New York and got to live among different communities in the 1800s, for good and for bad, made New York what it was and is today. It's a financial capital and really a thriving poly-ethnic community structure. And I think Los Angeles is looking now to use its communities to look to the east and look towards China and Japan and Korea as new powerhouses for the 21st century. So that's good for us. I mean, that's good. Los Angeles and California can really, I think, be the umbilical cord for that, both cementing relationships, economic ties, and I think cultural development. But yet it takes a real sort of visionary leadership that's going to get us there. And it takes a buy-in by communities to leave their safe areas to really experiment and to really engage in both the economic discourse, the civic discourse. We know from patterns over the years that communities that come form enclaves, and that ultimately those enclaves get assimilated and the old Americanization happens without any sort of forced pressure. And we all call ourselves Americans at the end. We may be hyphenated Americans, we may be Korean Americans or Jewish Americans, but we're all Americans in the end.